Yakir Levin is a philosopher from the Department of Philosophy in Ben-Gurion University in Be'er Sheva. He's also an expert on the philosophy of mind and in early modern philosophy, right? And we have met only a few years ago in the studies of consciousness, and we are now real active colleagues. We are discussing things, and he's part of, we belong to the same milieu. We meet, discuss things, and you will hear his view of what I do.
Okay. I am very pleased and greatly honored to take part in this symposium on Ilan Golani's work upon his reaching Gvurot, 80 years of age. Ilan is a dear friend, a true intellectual and a mensch, a fellow traveler on a long intellectual and personal journey. In the spirit of true love, though, I will not spare the rod, and in this short talk, will raise some questions concerning the scope of Ilan's highly original, non-standard, and bold approach in ethology. To put the cart a bit before the horses, the bottom line of my talk will be that although I think there are limits to Ilan's approach, it is highly interesting and of considerable theoretical importance. Let me start then by outlining the general contours of Ilan's ethological approach. The dominant tendency amongst contemporary ethologists is an ever-growing interest in the cognitive and even neurobiological basis of animal behavior. In that sense, contemporary ethologists are cognitive ethologists, or even neurocognitive ethologists. Ilan, by contrast, is a classical ethologist in the tradition of Konrad Lorenz, a founding father of ethology, that is, like Lorenz, is interested in behavior per se and not in the cognitive or neurobiological mechanisms that underlie it, nor in its functional dimensions. This is not to say that Ilan is a behaviorist that dismisses or downplays the importance of cognitive come neurobiological mechanisms or functional dimensions. Like Lorenz, Ilan isn't a behaviorist. Yet, and again like Lorenz, Ilan thinks that there is great explanatory value and theoretical importance in exploring animal behavior in and of itself, or distinctly from the question of whatever mechanisms may underlie it or what function it may play. Indeed, in his view, structural aspects of behavior are prior in the order of explanation to functional cognitive aspects, and these structural aspects are what he focuses on in his research. Despite the affinity between Ilan and Lorenz, there are some significant differences between them. Thus, while Lorenz is not always a man of his word with respect to the general ethological approach that Ilan shares with him, Ilan is very much so. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, Ilan does not share Lorenz's more concrete methodologies, his technologies, as Ilan calls it, for materializing his approach, methodologies that besides being non-systematic, non-rigorous, and of an intuitive nature, often enough include reference to function or cognitive dimension. Since the days of Lorenz and his co-founder of ethology, Nico Tinbergen, a lot of water has flowed under the bridges of Europe and in our Yarkon, and exploratory theoretical means that were not available to that generation have been added to the scientific arsenal. One of these means, of which Ilan makes a wide use, indeed importing it into ethology, has been one of his important innovations, is the movement notation developed by Noah Eshkol and Avraham Wachman in the late 1950s to describe dancing movements. Using this notation enables Ilan to describe behavior rigorously and systematically without referring to its function or cognitive basis. And this enables him, in turn, to expose common behavioral structures, behavioral homologies within and across species, irrespective of the functions or underlying cognitive basis of these structures. In addition, this use of the movement notation enables Ilan to discern fine distinctions between behavioral aspects that cannot be discerned without this means. With respect to considering behavioral structures, irrespective of their function, and the attempt to find behavioral homologies both within and across species, Ilan's methodology resembles the methodology pursued in anatomy, where the type of an organ is determined not by its function, but by its own structure, as well as its structural connection with other organs. From an anatomical point of view, since the forelimb of a man, a whale, and a bat occupy the same relative position in the anatomical structures of these animals, they are the same organ, even though they fulfill utterly different functions in each of these types of animal. This quasi-anatomical approach of Ilan and his movement notation-based attempt to find behavioral homologies across species is the most innovative and bold contribution to ethology. Indeed, it is the first attempt in ethology, and the only one thus far, to provide a rigorous account of behavior in non-functional and non-cognitive terms, an account which, interestingly enough, is nevertheless supposed to be cognitive. More on this a bit later. I will explain what I mean by an account that is given in non-cognitive and non-functional terms, but still is cognitive. Ilan's systematic pursuit of this approach has yielded some very interesting findings that attest to its fruitfulness. Moreover, these significant achievements raise a fascinating question about the source of the behavioral homologies across very different species. Anthropoids, such as the fruit fly, on the one hand, and mammals, such as the Tasmanian devil, on the other hand, that Ilan has exposed. Are these homologies related to common fundamental features of the 37 fundamental structures of organisms developed and sealed in the Cambrian period about 550 million years ago, 35 of which have survived to this day? Or do they relate to the order of ontogenetic development or the development during lifetime of the organisms exhibiting these homologies, or perhaps to some other factors? Whatever the answers to these questions may be, they illustrate the research prospects that Ilan's methodology opens and further attest to its theoretical fruitfulness. In all these respects, Ilan goes against the tide. His work is a classic in a non-classic guise, but Ilan also goes against the tide in his willingness to draw inspiration from past thinkers whose lessons in science have been forgotten or neglected. For example, Goethe, who besides being a great author and poet, was deeply interested in science. Early morning corrected poem, then Anatomy of Frogs, is a typical entry in his diary. There is also something very refreshing, at least from the viewpoint of the discipline from which I come, in the fact that Ilan draws inspiration from the eminent French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. As I said above, Ilan is not a behaviorist. Yet, there is a strong affinity between his approach and the approach of the so-called logical behaviorists, in that both approaches seek to deal with behavior in non-functional, non-cognitive, purely behavioral terms. Indeed, as I will show in the rest of my talk, the failures of logical behaviorism can shed important light on the scope and limits of Ilan's ethological approach. In addition, aspects of logical behaviorism can clarify what an account of behavior in non-functional, non-cognitive, purely behavioral terms means, and how such an account can still be considered cognitive. So let's make a brief excursion into logical behaviorism. The heydays of logical behaviorism in the 1950s are long bygone, and its great luminaries, Carl Hempel in the USA and Gilbert Ryle in England, long dead. Though not forgotten, Hempel's 1949 English version of his classic paper, The Logical Analysis of Psychology, is still highly cited, and Ryle's 1949 monograph, The Concept of Mind, is still considered one of the great masterpieces of 20th century philosophy. Nevertheless, logical behaviorism's strong formative influence is still felt to this day, and its contemporary heir, functionalism, which Yaron mentioned and outlined, to which I shall return a bit later from a somewhat different angle than Yaron's angle, is perhaps the dominant conception of mind in both philosophy and psychology. Here I somewhat disagree with Yaron, but it doesn't really matter for my talk. Indeed, as one eminent philosopher of mind has put it, functionalism is one of the major theoretical developments of 20th century philosophy. To get a grip on logical behaviorism, consider the following 4 types of behavior. Type 1, physiological reactions and responses. For example, perspiration, salivation, increase in the pulse rate, increase in blood pressure, twitching of muscles, and so on and so forth. Type 2, bodily motions. For example, my arms rising, my moving toward the fridge in the kitchen, throwing a baseball, a cat scratching a door, a rat turning in a tea maze. Type 3, actions involving bodily motions. For example, typing an invitation, greeting a friend, checking a book out of the library, going shopping, writing a check, telephoning your mother. Type 4, actions not involving overt bodily motions. For example, reasoning, guessing, calculating, judging, deciding. Logical behaviorists count only items falling under type 1 and type 2, what Gilbert Ryle called motions and noises, or what may be considered pure behavior, as genuine behavior. Indeed, the main thesis is that type 3 and type 4 non-pure behaviors can be completely analyzed or defined in terms of type 1 and type 2 pure behaviors. In their view, non-pure behaviors are nothing but dispositions to produce pure behaviors under certain specified conditions, behaviors that need not occur unless these conditions obtain. Similarly, water solubility is a disposition to dissolve when immersed in water, a process that need not occur if no immersion in water has occurred. Thus, consider a type 4 non-pure behavior, such as believing that it is raining. In the logical behaviorist analysis, it's a very simplified, but for our purposes it will suffice. One believes that it is raining if and only if, 1, when one goes out, one will wear a raincoat or take an umbrella, or both, or 2, when one is asked, is it raining, one would answer in the positive, or 3, and so on and so forth. Notice that one obtains only if, 4, one does not want to get wet. And condition 2 would obtain only if, 5, one understands what one is asked, and 6, one wants to tell the truth. So conditions 4 and 6 to 6 must be added to the definition of believing that it is raining. These further conditions, however, include non-pure behaviors. Such as understanding and wanting, which need further analysis in purely behavioral terms. Without such an analysis, not only would the addition of 4 to 6 render our exemplary definition of believing not purely behavioral, but this definition would be non-purely behavioral in the first place, for the dependence of 1 and 2 on 4 to 6 would imply that 1 and 2 carry substantial non-purely behavioral presuppositions and are thus themselves non-purely behavioral. Similar considerations apply to any further condition. For example, 7, one decides not to go out for a walk. That may be added to our definition, and which include non-pure behaviors. What this illustrates is that any definition of non-pure behaviors in purely behavioral terms is open-ended. Not only can it be indefinitely long, but there is no finite way of specifying the elements to be included in it. This is a problem enough. No term can be well defined whose definitions is open-ended and unspecific in this way. But the other side of the same coin, also illustrated by our example, is that any definition of non-pure behaviors in purely behavioral terms can be defeated by further non-pure behaviors which have to be added as further conditions to definition, as well as analyzed in purely behavioral terms, and so on and so forth. Thus, a logical behaviorist analysis of non-pure behaviors in purely behavioral terms would involve an infinite regress unless it involves conditions that include non-pure behaviors. That is, non-pure behaviors cannot be analyzed in purely behavioral terms. In other words, non-pure behaviors to pure behaviors connections are always defeasible by the occurrence of further pure behaviors, and not merely by physical barriers and hindrances. And so, on pain of infinite regress, no definition of non-pure behaviors in purely behavioral terms can succeed. Whatever the failures of logical behaviorism are, it may be taken to illustrate how an account of behavior in non-cognitive terms may still be cognitive. An analysis of non-pure behaviors in purely behavioral terms of the sort logical behaviorism seeks to provide is cognitive insofar as the analysandum is non-pure behavior, but given in non-cognitive terms insofar as the analysans consist of pure behaviors only. Back to Ilan's ethological program. Like the logical behaviorists, Ilan seeks to account for behavior in purely behavioral terms. Indeed, to provide a cognitive account of behavior in non-cognitive terms. However, unlike the logical behaviorists, he seems to consider as purely behavioral only behaviors of type 2, or bodily motions. What the failure of logical behaviorism to provide analysis of pure behaviors in purely behavioral terms shows is that there are behaviors that are not amenable to an account of the sort Ilan is seeking to provide. This is, of course, true for central behaviors of human beings, but it is also true for central behaviors of non-human animals, such as game playing, mating, preying, and tool use, behaviors that involve non-pure behaviors, or at least rudimentary or proto-behaviors of this type. Thus, consider a dog, for example, a dog chasing a cat that in its run climbs on a tree, which makes the dog hover around the tree, bark frantically at the cat, etc., etc. How can the dog's behavior be understood but as manifesting a belief or a proto-belief that the cat is on the tree and a desire or proto-desire to catch the cat, etc., etc.? This is not to deny that such behaviors could be partially accounted for a la Ilan's program, but these would be only partial or even very partial accounts. Thus, the fascinating possibility raised in one of my conversations with Ilan of providing a universal grammar of behavior whose fundamental building blocks are pure type 2 behaviors is not really achievable. אני גומר. עוד 3 דקות. Relatedly, contrary to what Ilan seems to imply, there is no priority in the order of explanation of pure behaviors over non-pure behaviors. That is, a science of behavior cannot be based on purely behavioral homologies. A main lesson of the failure of logical behaviorism to provide accounts of non-pure behaviors in terms of pure behavior is that the connection between pure and non-pure behavior is not a simple unidirectional bottom pure to up non-pure, but rather a complex bidirectional bottom up and top non-pure, down pure. This lesson has been a main driving force for transitioning from logical behaviorism to its contemporary heir, that is functionalism. Indeed, a main difference between logical behaviorism and functionalism, and it is a very big difference indeed, is that while logical behaviorism takes the connection between pure and non-pure behaviors to be unidirectional, bottom-up, functionalism takes this connection to be bidirectional, bottom-up and top-down. Applied to Ilan's ethological approach, what all this means is that Ilan's key analogy between the science of behavior and anatomy, which is highly illuminating and fruitful insofar as pure behaviors are concerned, this analogy breaks down in the case of non-pure behaviors. For non-pure behaviors have a fundamental dimension, psychology, for which there is no corresponding dimension in anatomical structures. It follows that the scope of Ilan's approach is limited. But this isn't really a problem for this approach, given its significant explanatory advantages. Indeed, a theory of everything in physics, in biology, or in ethology for that matter, is not only a dream in fact, but may also be so in principle for reasons on which I cannot dwell here. Moreover, cognitive ethology, which may perhaps deal better than Ilan's approach with non-pure behaviors, may have a limited scope as well the other way around. It may not be able to explain or deal with important aspects of pure behaviors which Ilan's approach can explain or deal with. Indeed, rather than being contrastive, these two ethological approaches may be complementary. And this raises the interesting question of how they relate to each other and of how it can be made that they join explanatory forces. Time for concluding. In the first part of the talk, I outlined Ilan's purely behavioral ethological approach, emphasizing its significant achievements and the fascinating explanatory prospects that it opens. In the second part, I argued for the limited scope of purely behavioral accounts of behavior, arguing also that this need not, indeed does not, raise a problem for Ilan's specific account of this type. Combined together, these two parts of the talk show that whatever limits I think there may be to purely behavioral explanations, Ilan's specific account of this type is highly interesting and of considerable theoretical importance, a most important contribution to the science of behavior.
Functionalism as the alternative to behaviorism. The alternative to behaviorism and the failure of logical behaviorism is something that culminates in functionalism. But is there not a third possibility? I think that it's also something that is relevant to Ilan's work. For instance, it doesn't. The fact that the movement is part also of this approach, the fact that it is an embedded view, which you cannot find a correlative idea in functionalism. For instance, multiple realizability is not possible in this regard. But the main question is whether you think that the kind of functionalism that you recommend, or you think that this has an advantage, that the kind of functionalism you think has an advantage over the pure behavior, is committed to determinism of the experiments.
Well, I didn't really elaborate on functionalism. What really mattered for me in that talk, and that was the point on which I focused, is the analogy between Ilan's approach and the logical behaviorist approach. And what I try to show is that aspects of the failure or the failures of logical behaviorism reflect also on Ilan's approach, though they don't really cause a serious problem to Ilan's approach. It only shows that the approach is somewhat limited. Now, there might be other alternatives. It doesn't really matter to me whether functionalism is the better alternative, or the main point is that what functionalism shows is that the connection between behavior and mental states, or pure behavior and non-pure behaviors, is much more complicated than a bottom-up connection. And the connection should be whatever other approach you adopt, the connection must be non-reductive and bidirectional. It goes bottom up and top down, from the purely behavioral to the non-purely behavioral, and non-purely behavioral to the purely behavioral. And you can't really avoid the non-purely behavioral aspects of behavior, the non-pure aspects. The non-pure aspects are there to stay with us. And that was the main important. That was the important point for me. Whatever other approach you will adopt, it will have to take in account this insight of gained by the failure of the criticisms raised against logical behaviorism in the 60s and 70s of the last century. And that is the main important. Now, whether functionalism is the optimal alternative, that doesn't really matter to me. Probably it's not the optimal or best alternative, but I have also, all kinds of reservations concerning externalism and embodied embedded cognition. There are many, many problems. We don't have right now an optimal theory. Every theory of mind, of action, and of behavior, at least those I know of, have many problems. And I think that maybe there isn't only one theory. Some combination of these theories, some synthesis, will be the best theory. But we don't have now, the best theory. There isn't such a thing. All of them suffer from severe problems. And we learn more from the problems than from their achievements. And the logical behaviorism had many problems. And now it's, I think, the arguments against logical behaviorism were devastating. I mean, there is a wide consensus. You won't find any logical behaviorist today. But still, what is very interesting, extremely interesting about Ilan's approach is that he uses, I don't think that Ilan knew the theoretical background. He came to it all by himself. He didn't know the philosophical and the psychological. There is also a psychological branch of behaviorism. Skinner and Watson, and which was very influential at one point in the development of psychology. Skinner was a professor at Harvard, and he was very, very influential. And so I don't think that Ilan really knew that he came to it all by himself. And what is interesting is that, very interesting, I find it extremely interesting, is that he uses an approach that is very similar to their approach, but without he can use it in a specific area of behavior, pure behaviors, and then there it works, and it works with extremely interesting results. I mean, there are many findings which are very, very interesting, and discoveries. So it's a sort of logical behaviorism without the problems of logical behaviorism. And that is, I think, is a very impressive and significant achievement, which I think that the philosophical community should know about it, because it gives a different angle on the logical behaviorism and non-logical behaviorism debate in philosophy and in psychology. And philosophers and psychologists, they don't know that work. They don't know ethology, most of them. And even those who know ethology and knows Ilan's work, they're not aware. For instance, what's the name of that? There are two ethologists who refer to your... No. I forgot the name. I recall it. Because he published his work in '92 in Brain and Behavioral Sciences, which is an interdisciplinary journal in which philosophers, psychologists, biologists, neurobiologists write. It's a very important... and then people responded to his... but I think that they didn't get that point. And this is a very important point. That, and another point, which I think is also, I consider it very important, and with important implications, is that I think that you can join forces. You can come to ethology with Ilan's approach, and then from the cognitive or neurocognitive approach, and they can be complementary. And there isn't one approach that is the right approach, as is usual in life, and also in philosophy. And I think that somehow combining these approaches might be very interesting, that you may be able to explain aspects of behavior. For instance, all the fascinating homologies that Ilan discovered, and the origin. Where do they come from? Yakir. What is... Yeah. Okay. I have to finish.
Thank you very much, Yakir. We'll take one last 10 minutes break. In 3:35, we'll be back here with the happiness groom, who will be the last lecturer.
על הקרשים, יש לי... אני עברתי היום... אני יכול לקבל את זה שלי?
כן.
זה. אני מוציא אותו פשוט, נכון?